Welcome, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bjørn. I'm an associate professor here at the Royal Academy of Music in Aarhus, where we today have the great honor of hosting the lecture in Knowledge in the Arts number 6, organized by the International Center for Knowledge in the Arts in Copenhagen. And we have something very exciting for you, directly from Den Haag. But before that, I think I'll pass the microphone or the floor to Professor Kristoffer Gansing, who is the daily head of the Center for Knowledge in the Arts. Kristoffer.
Thank you, Bjørn. Thank you to the Royal Academy of Music for hosting us here today for, as Bjørn said, the 6th event in this series of Knowledge in the Arts. I'm Kristoffer, and I'm professor and the director of this center that coordinates and contextualizes, discusses, and tries to generally collaboratively advance the field of artistic research across the artistic higher institutions for artistic education in Denmark. And this counts no less than 7 art educational institutions. And that also means that we are working across different disciplines, so not only music, but also film, visual arts, performing arts. Some of you that are here physically today probably know some of our activities, because I recognize also some faces from the Kunstnerisk Udviklingsvirksomhed activities that we are also coordinating to some extent across the schools. But we also have an online audience, an international audience, so I welcome you as well. And this series is really an attempt to then bring together, in a way, common concerns in a transdisciplinary way across these different disciplines that we work. But that said, it's also like, not shying away from specific questions and issues that pertain to the different artistic disciplines with which we deal. But we invite the speakers also on the basis of thinking that the research that they have to share is also kind of having a general purchase on the discussion of artistic research on an overall field. But it's good to have this kind of dialogue between the specific and the general that we try to have through this series. And we thought it was very fitting then that today we could be here in Aarhus for the first time at the Royal Academy of Music, because we feature an artist researcher that is working specifically from the field of composition and music making. And to say a little bit about him, it's Paul Craenen who gave the talk today. And he's a researcher and composer that works at the intersection of artistic practice, education, and research. There's a long CV that you can study online. I mentioned some key points from this. He had graduated with a PhD from Leiden University in 2011, where he worked on artistic research and the status of the performing body in contemporary composed music. And I believe that the publication you did in 2014 relates to this. It's called Composing Under the Skin, the music-making body at the composer's desk, which was published by Leuven University Press. You have also taught piano and experimental music at various music schools. You have been director of Musica, a Flemish organization for art education from 2012 to 2018. And in early 2018, since then, you've appointed research professor and head of the lecturate Music, Education and Society at the Royal Conservatory in The Hague. And I think you're also a staff member at the Academy of Creative Performing Arts at Leiden University, where you work as a guest lecturer, but also a supervisor for artistic research. I would like to quote an earlier article that Craenen wrote, or something at least I found at this text on your website, where you have written about the time of artistic research, and I quote, "At the heart of artistic research in music is a moment of wonder, frustration, surprise, or fascination that temporarily stops or blocks the musical flow. It is in that pause between play and replay, between search and research, that an artistic research question, project or plan can take shape. And I believe, just intuitively probably, that this argument is something that you will elaborate and refine for us further today in your talk. This is very relevant for the discussion also of artistic research, also specifically in the Danish context, where in the field of kunstnerisk udviklingsvirksomhed, to translate this term into into the English, it's also artistic development work, which is a term that implies already a kind of a temporality, a direction of taking your practice further, developing it, your artistry further. And however, an under-discussed or always discussed, but still not at all resolved issue is where does this, where does the moment of reflection or the moment of research enter into this practice of development? And I think this is an issue that you will get around, and we are looking forward to discuss with you today, Paul. And so I welcome you very much. Let's welcome Paul Craenen.
Thank you so much, Kristoffer, for the kind words and for having me here, and for allowing me to share some thoughts on, well, you have been, I was really surprised that you found this kind of quote, because I forgot about it, and it's really the essence of what I would like to talk about. So this idea was lingering in my head for a longer time, apparently. So thank you for this. So my talk will be in two parts. I will have a larger part based on a talk I gave at the EPARM conference in London earlier this year, which was a very short lecture, but I will elaborate on this. And then after a short pause, I will try to come to a kind of very provisional sketch of something what I call artistic research as an interruptive practice. And that's something I would like to do after a little break. So I have around 60 minutes in total of mainly talking. I'm sorry for that. I have some video files as well, so some music as little breaks in between. Let's go. Is my sound okay? Just checking with also for the online aspect. Okay, but I can continue, or I should wait for a minute? Okay. So, since we have started to approach artistic research as a possible side of, artistic practice as a possible side of research, one of the main questions has been, as Kristoffer was saying, how to relate the subjectivity of the artist immersed in her or his artistic practice or creation to the reflectivity of that same artist when analyzing or interpreting what emerges as shareable knowledge in this practice. At least the possibility to share knowledge beyond the own practice is an expectation we may have when somebody uses the word research in an academic context. That artists can acquire a form of embodied knowledge and understanding through experimentation in their practice will not be contested by many. It is also a matter of common sense to say that artistic research requires the artistic practice to be central. And this emphasizes the role of the expert or expert knowledge in action. And with this also the temporal situatedness of this knowledge. Within the musical field, it means that we need a flow of the music to make this knowledge audible and perhaps visible as well. So performing and creating music requires a dedication to the doing, to the musical action, that is very different from talking or writing about that experience. Nevertheless, without words, it is difficult to share or simply to frame something as being an outcome of research. And whether we find this relevant or not, the word research also evokes other words like observation, analysis, discussion, activities that suggest the possibility to take a reflective distance. They seem to require some form of abstraction or transposition of the knowledge that manifests itself within the musical flow. For the researching musician then, artistic research rests on a combination of positions inside and outside musical time. And this is often taken for granted, as if the fact that both positions can be held by the same person guarantees direct access to the experience in practice from a position outside of musical time. But how exactly can researching musicians build their off-time reflections on the moment of performance? What methods do we have as artistic researchers to report from emerging insights in artistic practice? And in what sense can such process become critical? Making the experience of insight transparent and the resulting knowledge explicit for others has remained a challenge and demands an alternation, or rather a combination of positions of proximity and distance to the flow of the music. And I believe these two words, proximity and distance, are more useful than the familiar notions of subjectivity and objectivity, since they refer not to differences between insiders and outsiders, but rather to different degrees of involvement with the artistic process. Within musical artistic research, this may also refer to different temporal positions one can take in relation to the flow of the music. And I will elaborate on these possible positions by referring to a conversation I had with 4 artistic researchers earlier this year. A transcript of this conversation has just been published by the journal European Drama and Performance Studies, so I will not reproduce this conversation completely, but I will refer to each of the participants and a bit of their practice as well. And I will also use some of their quotes, quotes you can find in this article. I will give all the references of the article at the end of my lecture. Let us first watch a short video clip of Jet Wens, who is a colleague of mine at Leiden University and who is researching historical acting techniques and their relationship to musical practices. Recently, Jet has been doing research on melodramas, which is a musical genre in which an expressively speaking voice is combined with music in a performance style that completely disappeared from the stage after the beginning of the 20th century. So let's hear just 2 minutes of such a melodrama with Jet Wens speaking and Artem Belogorov at the piano.
Snowdrops, daffodils, primroses and violets, cool word, clear word, dewy word and sweet. Think them and see them, say them over drowsily, feel them on your hot head and dabble with your feet. White wooded snowdrops, white and gold and apple green, wet wild daffodils tossing by the stream, daffy's wings to fan you, and was there ever anything cool as a snowdrop? Even in a dream. Sweet in the young grass, like a fairy paper chase, primroses twinkle. Add them to the cure. With one white violet, like a garden far away. First you think you smell it, and then you're not so sure.
I will gently fade out Jet here. In our conversation, Jet expressed an internal conflict he experiences as a researcher and performer who works on these melodramas. As a researcher, he strongly experiences the distance to this repertoire that is situated in a time very different from ours. On the other hand, he also feels the necessity of embodying, feeling, and even believing what is conveyed in the text and performance style at the moment of performance. And I think you could all see and hear this on this video excerpt. And in this particular case, it also includes late romantic ideals of beauty and spirituality, which are not necessarily his ideals or beliefs. On the contrary, in his own words, through his research, He said that he has even become allergic to the popular, in his opinion, exaggerated narratives of art, spirituality, and elevation that were so popular at the time. So it is as if Jet, stepping out of his performance, becomes someone else who, from an intellectual viewpoint, can be very critical of the content and the message he conveys and embodies as a performer. So there seems to be a tension here between the researcher in the flow of the performance and the researcher outside of this flow. He can alternate between those two positions, but not perform them simultaneously. And I believe Jet's case is an example of the researching musician for whom the performing eye and the reflecting eye are almost two different personalities, inhabiting what I would call different time zones in the research process. We can recognize this temporal separation in many kinds of research-related activities within the musical field. Think of electronic music, or sound art, or composed music, when artists engage in all kinds of instrumental, technical, acoustical, or even mathematical investigations to prepare and create the conditions for their creative work. In the same vein, in historical performance practice, it is very common for musicians to go to libraries to study manuscripts and treatises.
Once it expired,
had to accompany a singer in a Mozart aria. And while performing, she tried to ask herself questions she would raise as a musicologist, like, where exactly is the Enlightenment subjectivity in these notes? Is the regime of absolute monarchy reflected exactly there, in this phrase? Does this arpeggio represent Idamante's secret sexual agitation, and exactly how? Now, while performing, while accompanying the singer, it doesn't surprise that she quickly realized that these questions became absurd, as if they were being asked at the wrong moment and place, about something other than the reality at hand. I asked, am I actually thinking about this music? Clearing my mind, I realized that words connected to what was going on did flow in, albeit rarely, but these words had nothing to do with signification, being instead, doing this really fast is fun, or here comes a big jump. So this seems to confirm a difference between thinking in the time of performance and reflection in the time of musicological analysis. It doesn't mean there is no thinking while playing. On the contrary, performing classical music is usually an intense cognitive activity involving alertness, continuous responding to the situation, and making short-time decisions. With improvising musicians, this even becomes more obvious, since what they present to us is clearly the result of a thinking process in music that occupies their minds and bodies. But the thinking seems to be of a different nature than the reflection happening outside of musical time. We can imagine that some of the questions Abate was raising may play a role in the preparation of a performance, but while performing, the pianist on stage simply seems to lack the necessary mental bandwidth to engage with such questions. And it's probably more than a question of bandwidth. Abate also says that the questions became absurd, which also means that they were not meaningful at the time of performance. Even if there would be more mental capacity, these are probably not the kind of questions that would emerge. Moreover, critically reflecting on such questions while performing the music might also lead to all kinds of doubts that could undermine and potentially interrupt the flow of performance. This brings me to a quote of Jet Wentz again from the article that was just published. He says, and I have to, it's very small here, My point of view had always been that during performance, I have to believe that whatever version I am doing is the only possible best version. As a researcher preparing to perform, I have to get myself into a state of belief. As soon as I get off the stage, I can question whether the performance was indeed any good at all, but not in the moment itself. And a bit further, the preparation is the place where the artist and the researcher interact the most closely. The researcher me has to convince the artist me that this will be the best possible performance, so that by the time I get on stage, I have absorbed the parameters of what I am doing to such an extent that I can work with them to create that most beautiful, most moving, and most convincing performance. We already made a distinction between reflection in and outside the musical time, but Jet's quote leads to a further distinction we could make between reflection that happens before and after a performance in a research context. If the preparation is indeed focused on delivering the best possible performance, then it may consist of doing all kinds of research to inform artistic choices, but eventually it also needs to become a phase of building self-confidence in these choices. This also makes clear how the musical performance differs from the scientific experiment that may be carried out in a more agnostic state of mind, or even with a kind of disbelief. It seems much more difficult to think of a public artistic performance in an agnostic sense, in a way that includes the possibility to fail completely and to perceive this failure as a success because you have proved something. Even in an educational context where we try to convince music students that failure is permitted, and maybe that's something people here will recognize, it seems to be very difficult to go to a performance with such an agnostic state of mind. Performance creates a situation of conviction. It incites what I would call an activist rather than an agnostic state of mind. Of course, critical evaluation can happen afterwards and feed into the preparation of a next performance. And in this way, we enter the typical feedback loop that is common to any kind of conscious learning process. This idea of the feedback loop invites us to make an analogy with more common research models. Although the mindset of an artist during a performance may indeed be quite different from the mindset in a scientific experiment, formally, the time model of first doing some research to make artistic choices about what to play, why, where, etc., then putting these choices into practice through experimentation and rehearsal, then the performance itself, and finally its evaluation, that all looks not very different from more conventional research or development models that typically consist of the feedback loop of proposing something or modeling something, testing this model or this proposition, observing and evaluating the results, and then adapting your model based on this evaluation. So from this perspective, one might think of a musical performance as an experiment of which the conditions have been carefully prepared in advance. The phase of performance then could be regarded as a testing of the preceding artistic choices, the bodily training, the tuning of the instruments, the curational approaches, and so forth. Following this analogy, all the things that were put into place to make the performance happening could then be regarded as a formulation of some kind of artistic hypothesis that subsequently is tested in the performance. However, we should realize that from the moment that we start to understand a performance as a testing ground, we make a shift from a performance we expect to convince aesthetically in the first place, as was expressed so eloquently by Jet Wentz, to a more curiosity-driven event that requires openness for whatever emerges in the performance in order to learn something from it. And this shift is more problematic than it may at first appear, especially in the context of classical music. There exists what I would call a silent contract between performer and audience that creates implicit expectations about the way the performance is prepared, the respect the performer shows for the music, the audience, the context, and so forth. So this doesn't really invite self-criticism on stage, but rather leads to a pressure that in the best cases it can indeed push the performer to create something memorable, to bring something to life in unprecedented ways. In my opinion, the biggest pressure on performance of classical music is not one of reproduction or representation, as it is often framed today in classical music studies. It is a pressure of transcendence. But in the context of artistic research and in the performing arts in general, we also have become familiar with a type of performance that seems to mitigate overly heavy expectations of transcendence. And at first glance, it seems to resonate very well with the idea of research. It is the type of performance that is presented as work in progress. And this suggests that there is a value in presenting something in an unfinished state. What might that value be? And in what ways can performance as work in progress be used in the context of artistic research? Before trying to give an answer to this question, let us first take a closer look at the idea of performance as a testing ground by looking at the practice of a pianist and researcher, Anna Scott, here on the slide. Her method consists of imitating early 20th century piano recordings of romantic or late romantic piano music in a very precise manner. And what is fascinating about this is that what we hear on these recordings is often quite different in terms of style, approach, and interpretation from what we usually hear in more recent recordings of the same pieces. These performers of 1 century ago often took much more freedom rhythmically, and they often did not play exactly what is written in the score. So this makes these reenactments of these recorded performances sometimes very surprising and even shocking for a contemporary audience. So this just as a little introduction to the practice of Anna Scott. In our conversation, Scott had a different view on the temporal relationship and the role of preparation, performance, and reflection in her practice. Scott is working with historical material, just like Wentz, and she recognized quite a lot of the things he said. She was also used to prepare her performances in a very close analytical way and through a rigorous process of memorization so as to create the best possible copy at the moment of performance. But she told us about an experience she recently had in the recording session, of which we see a video excerpt here, and for which she had carefully prepared a performance copy of a 1930 recording of pianist Fanny Davis. And she was confident to be able to record this copy in 1 or 2 takes. But then in the studio, something didn't quite work. The sound engineer pointed at something she didn't quite capture about the way Fanny Davis plays the opening of the piece. And after many tries, they came to the realization that the problem was sort of a timing issue, but much more so an issue of inhabiting the mindset of Fanny Davis. And I propose that we just now listen to this moment where it happens. So Anna was had been sharing this with me. So this is a recording from the recording session with a fisheye cam, and they have been trying quite a lot of things for a while. And this is the moment that the sound engineer says, like, wait a minute, maybe we should try something different. Notice also the very vague kind of language used between the pianist and the sound engineer, which at the same time seems very clear to them, and maybe that's something musicians will recognize. So being very vague and very precise at the same time.
Although she's playing sort of in tempo, it almost sounds as if she's not that.
Yeah.
It's like chord, do 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 do. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
It's something to do with the way she starts the piece.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like the middle stuff is kind of a separate.
Absolutely.
It's in its own time feel. It's in a different.
It's
time
not
feel.
really the timing. It's the mental. It's the way she is thinking of it.
Yeah. Okay. I'll
Okay.
try that.
Shall we try?
Yeah. Yeah, but then.
It's coming.
Yeah.
It's just a slightly different idea.
Yeah.
just for your information, she's playing this with the initial recording in one ear. So she's matching these timings very, very precisely. So that's what she's doing. She's really making a copy of this. And so she was struggling with timing issues, and then the sound engineer came up with it's the way she's thinking about it. And then suddenly everything became clear. So that's fascinating to see this happening, just like how such words can change the whole scope, the whole perspective on the thing. So perhaps this solution to inhabit Fanny's mindset could be understood as a more indirect way of trying to achieve the goal, less focused on the concrete technicalities and more on a kind of mental experimentation. In the words of the sound engineer, so it's the way she's thinking about it. So it is about approaching the music from a different mental position. And interestingly, this more indirect approach appeared to work more directly than trying to analytically match the timings of the recording. And Scott explained that since this moment, this experience, this more questioning approach, as she calls it, has become an integral part of her practice, to such an extent that in her view there is no separation anymore between performance and reflection. She even talks about a reversal of the phases, where the analytical or interpretative work we would expect in a preparation phase is only happening after the performance. So preparation for her means now, first of all, listening to these recordings, and if there is a kind of analysis or interpretation, maybe that can come afterwards in her research. Now, if questioning can indeed happen during performance, what kind of questioning are we talking about here? It probably isn't the kind of musicological questioning about signification Caroline Abate was raising in her experiment. If we transpose the case we see here to other possible situations, we could argue that a performance can never be completely fixed in advance. Some aspects or dimensions of an interpretation, a musical interpretation, can be and perhaps should be left open to the moment of a performance. As such, we acknowledge that performance is always unfinished business, not only because of the unexpected things that may happen, but also because it needs those openings and challenges to become performance. Scott talks about the provocations she tries to make within her performances. And this not only refers to the fact that she confronts the audience with sometimes very unusual ways of performing classical music pieces, but also to the blockages she feels within herself when performing, being herself a trained and disciplined body. So she says, I find that I'm searching for what those provocations might be, and I'm finding myself really alert to forces that might be constraining my performance, and to make a conscious decision, the emphasis is mine, in the moment to break through those constraints to see what happens. So what emerges here is the idea of performance as a testing ground in a more radical sense, not as a test of something completely defined in advance, as in a scientific experiment, but as a place where things can emerge in unprecedented ways, and as such I would argue that it becomes a research event in the strong sense of the word. And such concept of a research event raises some questions about the status of performances in artistic research. For instance, at the end of an artistic research project in music, and I'm thinking of about the ones I know, sometimes PhD projects, but also master research projects, in most cases there is some talking, or there is a paper, and there is a performance. So these are the main two products at the closure of such project. But what actually is the status of such performance if you present it like this? For most people, such a performance at the end of a process is perceived as being the result, or maybe even the documentation or the demonstration of the whole preceding research process. But if we call the performance an event, then it can't be simply the documentation or demonstration of an outcome. It always should be something more. And this may also call into question the notion of performance as a work in progress, what I raised in one of the other slides. We could echo here the comment of Jet Wens that what he does at the time of performance must be the only best version. And although he explained this from the idea of beauty, I think it can also be understood from the perspective of the singularity inherent in the concept of performance. And this, in my opinion, all explains why the moment of performance in artistic research, especially when it is a public moment, from an epistemological viewpoint, often will have a very ambiguous status, which is not necessarily a problem to be solved. More fruitful could be to look at the research potential of the social dimension of the time of performance. What we saw on the video is not a public performance on stage, but a recording session. But there was one element in the reflective process that was of a truly social nature. That was a conversation with the sound engineer. And it was crucial for the whole breakthrough in the session. The sound engineer was not listening in a very technical way or only. He was in a way sharing the musical intentionality of Anna Scott. And from this position, he was able to interrupt the playing of Scott to point at a possibility she could then pick up and do something with it. And from this collaborative perspective, we might regain some support for this idea of performance as a work in progress. A possible reason to present a performance as such is to invite those who listen to contribute to it. Maybe that should be the only reason to present something as a work in progress, to invite to contribute to it, by giving feedback or perhaps even by interrupting it in order to prepare the next step. And in my conclusion, I will come back to this potential of the social dimension of interruption in artistic research. So, let us go to another example from contemporary music and very experimental kinds of sound art and music. Trombonist, composer and instrument builder Kevin Fairbairn added yet another view on this time relationship within artistic research. Preparation in his case also includes handwork and craftsmanship to create the objects and musical instruments with which he performs. And these objects and materials become part of his performance in a very present and active way. It's a bit difficult to just play a very short fragment, but maybe I will go a bit further to get at least. So that I will skip a little bit. Just a very little excerpt from a much longer improvisation or composition, I should say. As you can notice here, the sense of control is very different from the previous examples. And that's exactly what Fairbairn also is aiming at. At some moments for Fairbairn, it even feels as if the material takes over agency in the performance. And he describes this experience as alienating, as if he becomes a kind of spectator within his own performance, observing what happens, even though he created the conditions for it. And this points at another possible time relationship within artistic research. When in Anna Scott's case, aspects of research we would traditionally situated in the preparation for a performance were postponed to the performance or even after the performance. In the case of Fairbairn, a situation is created that allows him to take a step back at some moments to observe what happens, which is something we would rather associate with an evaluation phase when we listen back to a recording of our performance. Such spectatorship as a performer within performance is of course also made possible by the aesthetic idiom and also the philosophical framework in which the work of Fairbairn can be situated. We could perhaps label this kind of work as experimental music, but it also has characteristics of sound art in the sense that in sound art we often have a less teleological time approach, which allows to step in and out of the flow of sound in ways that are less evident in music. Philosophically, Fairbairn is also heavily involved with theories of Karen Barat and new materialism, and in this spirit he seems to be looking for the liminal spaces where he doesn't have the full control and where he can experience something of the agency of the material and of sound itself. And whatever we may think of the new materialist discourse of non-human agencies and interactions and entanglements, it is clear that we have a framework here in which the role of the performer is not to direct or lead the musical process in one specific direction. What is proposed here is the listening to what emerges within performance and to respond to it not with a typical human intentionality of expressing or externalizing something, but rather to participate in an alert and response-able way, to use one of those neologisms of Karen Barat. Again, just as was the case with Anna Scott's questioning in performance, we should ask ourselves what kind of observations we are talking about here. It probably won't be some kind of psychoacoustic analysis on the spot. There might also be a slight difference with the questioning of Anna Scott, who is consciously provoking things in performance. Such more intentional experimentation is probably an example of what Donald Schoen once called reflection in action. The notion of the spectator Fairbairn brought up here made me wonder about another possibility. Could we also imagine observation in performance having the aim not so much to change the flow of the performance, but rather to learn about performance or about the impact of sounding interactions? This may open some interesting avenues in terms of possible methods we can use in the context of artistic research, if the product is not focused on delivering, or the outcome not delivered, focused on delivering a kind of aesthetically convincing product in the first place. Of course, this will depend, this possibility, very much on the idiom and the aesthetic framework. So that's also what it was made possible probably here in this context of experimental music. It's much harder to think about such an experiment in a classical music idiom, I would say. The possibility of observing performance from an external viewpoint as a performer was also confirmed by Susan Tunka, who is a dancer and a choreographer. Just a little excerpt here of a performance of her. It's a trailer, actually. Tunka is currently involved in a PhD research in which she explores altered states of knowing in dance, and her practice also involves improvisation. And she stresses that to allow such an external perspective as a performer in performance, you have to allow the body to take over. Compared with Fairbairn's view of the material that at sometimes takes over, this seems to be an even more radical step, where the body of the performer gets a life of its own and becomes an agency that can be observed by the dancer. Now, this may sound strange for an outsider, but for dancers who only have their bodies to work with, it is not at all uncommon to conceptualize their bodies as a kind of living material with which they enter in a dialogue within performance. And a dialogue, in my interpretation, suggests the awareness of a presence that is at some distance, but within vicinity, within reach of communication and exchange. However, Tunka also stressed that something needs to happen before the body can take over, and she argued that it needs a disengagement from control by means of a very complex inner mechanism, probably relying on the one hand on highly developed automated skills, on the other hand on a receptiveness for the proprioceptive signals coming from within your own body, informing you about what happens to you within performance. Engaging with such information in a conscious way, for instance, through observing or resisting spontaneous reflexes or impulses, may be fundamental to a research capacity that is unique to performing artists. And in Tunka's view, it is on the edge between memorized movement patterns and spontaneously emerging movements, especially also in the context of improvisation, that there might emerge a space for questioning how what she calls an extra or transpersonal creative agency can be activated in performance. Perhaps we could think of this as walking the line between being completely absorbed in the doing and being able to continuously reposition yourself in subtle and mental ways during performance, to observe and act in a more reflective manner, perhaps even to observe the thinking of your performing body. Now, these all may sound very speculative, but I believe we are touching here on a research potential within the time of performance that is not yet fully conceptualized or integrated in common artistic research methodology. A crucial question here is to find ways of reporting from such observations within performance. As I said in my introduction, we seem to take for granted a possible transfer of knowledge between what I called in-time and off-time positions, as long as it happens within one and the same individual, the researching artist. However, from psychological research and from creativity studies, we know that introspection is a notoriously unreliable tool, especially when there is a lot of time in between the artistic experience and the introspective report of this experience. And here it becomes worthwhile to introduce this notion of interruption in artistic research, but I propose that I interrupt my talking here for a moment, and that I do this last little bit of the talk after a little break. Is that okay to you, Kristoffer? Or should I continue? It's still, I still have like one slide with it's like 15 minutes. What do you want? It's up to you. Are you not falling asleep yet? It's okay. Should I continue? Okay, let's go then. So, talking or writing about an artistic experience can create an experience of loss through the felt disconnection from the stream of sensory input and our immediate corporal, emotional, imaginative responses to it. From the moment you switch from making or experiencing music to reflecting on that process, you interrupt that stream. But the interruption can also create an opening for something else. If musical artistic research were to fully coincide with the time of making and performing music, it would make no sense at all to make a distinction between research and practice. And although that is a perfectly legitimate position, I prefer to look for a possible relevance of artistic research in its offering a playground where we can consciously change positions in relation to the artistic process in the first place. Changing positions always creates interruptions. Interrupting something means creating a divide or a distance, a before and an after, a here and a there. Although interruptions alone do not induce reflectivity or criticality, they, for instance, can also cause distraction. They can create the conditions for it. And therefore, I would like to share with you some very provisional thoughts on the use of interruptions in artistic research and create a kind of first sketch of artistic research as an interruptive practice. So it will be a list of first ideas, not necessarily very much connected to each other. From a temporal perspective, we can think of interruptions as temporal cuts. An obvious example of such a cut in music is the cell phone ringing in the classical concert hall. An event that in a split second may destroy the immersive experience because it shifts the attention from the stage or your imagination to something or somebody in the room. And this also demonstrates how the temporal and the spatial are very much interdependent when something is interrupted. Temporal cuts cause spatial shifts, and often it's also vice versa. Interruptions may have various possible effects. It depends on the musicians on stage. If the cell phone will literally stop the flow of the music, they can also choose to ignore it and to continue playing. Or they can start playing with the tune of the cell phone. Well, we have many examples of this as well on YouTube. Yeah, so you have, and might also be the case that maybe some people in the hall even didn't notice it. So it can have all kinds of effects, which leads me to the observation that interruptions can happen also on a purely mental level. From the perspective of the listener, probably the most common interruption in a concert is the loss of attention for what happens on stage. And the spatial effect of that interruption is thoughts beginning to wander or eyes starting to look around in the hall. From a performer's perspective, mental interruptions can be the alienating experiences Kevin Fairbairn was telling about, or it might be simply the concrete shift of attention to a specific element in the performance. Any shift of attention is a change of position and is, as such, an interruption of some stream you're in. Interruptions as temporal cuts and spatial shifts are not enough to produce reflectivity. Paradoxically, an interruption becomes most valuable when it gives access to the stream or the continuity that was interrupted. So the purpose of interrupting in the context of artistic research may be to capture something of the unfolding of that stream before it evaporates, like taking a snapshot of something. So you interrupt something in order to grasp something that is otherwise impossible to grasp. We may get some support from psychology here. John Sloboda, in an article, I think it's an old one, it's 1985, once raised the question how to understand and how to isolate from a scientific viewpoint and get access to the mental operations in composers while they are composing. He said it will not happen by examining their scores or sketchbooks, not by interviewing them long after the compositional event, not by asking them what they believe they do, not by poring over the letters and writings of long-dead composers. None of these strategies will work for rather obvious and well-established reasons. The only thing which gives a chance of working is to have a living composer speaking all his or her thoughts out loud to an observer or a tape recorder. Now, this quote is a good example of the skepticism regarding the scientific reliability of introspection in the arts. Unfortunately, the method Sloboda proposes is almost impossible to use in a musical performance. But what perhaps comes close is, at least for a moment, is indeed to interrupt a performance and to immediately report from what happened just before. That's a snapshot idea. Interruptions have the most forceful effect when they are unexpected or when they come from the outside. Again, in psychology, we also know the so-called Zeigarnik effect, which says that in most circumstances, people tend to recall interrupted tasks better than completed ones. As an example, most people of my generation, I guess most people in this room, would probably know what they were doing and where they were at 9/11, 2001. So that's probably an example of an interrupted task. A common example from music is a teaching situation when the student is performing something and the teacher suddenly interrupts the playing to create a kind of micro shock effect, making the student aware of what he or she was been doing right at that moment. In the context of artistic research, however, we should be able to use interruptions in a more structural way. A form of interruption that keeps something of this power of the surprise in a more controlled environment is what I would call the collaborative interruption. We saw an example with the sound engineer who was interrupting Anna Scott. He was sharing the temporal flow of the music, but from a different position, and as such he was able to interrupt the playing in a critical and constructive way. We often speak about intersubjectivity as the form of criticality that artistic research can provide. And I believe this is a good example of how this actually can work in reality. Namely by sharing time, I think that's really crucial, sharing time from different positions, while holding an interruptive responsibility to bring to the foreground elements of the artistic process that would be difficult to grasp from a purely individual perspective. Now, this is just like a fresh idea. I didn't think this out more concretely. But perhaps there might be a potential here to develop artistic research methodology that goes beyond the open, respectful, constructive feedback methods we all know today, and we often use, especially in art education. Maybe we can try to develop something with more critical force, using this combination of first and second person perspectives. Mental interruptions while performing will often be negative, in the sense that they don't interrupt the unfolding of an action, but rather prevent an action or process to unfold. Think of your resistance to fall asleep during a lecture like this, or think of the blockages Anna Scott was talking about, the blockages she feels when performing and she tries to push through it. Such negative interruptions are easily forgotten after a performance because they never became audible or visible in a very direct way. However, they may exactly provide the information that is relevant to the first-person perspective in artistic research. I already referred to the difficulty of documenting and sharing first-person experiences and insights. We could think of keeping practice diaries where you collect experiences and insights right after performance, or maybe after such an interruption. In a very disciplined way, this may become what is often called today an auto-ethnographic research method. But although such methods can work very well for some, I hesitate a bit to place all hope in journaling methods and forms of writing that try to come as close as possible to the artistic process by creating a kind of verbal analogy of what happens during that process. And at this point, Susan Tunka, in our conversation, shared something that I also recognized from my own artistic research long ago, 15 years ago, namely the fact that the more abstract her writing and her language in her research project becomes, the closer she seems to get or to approximate what her performance is about. And I indeed believe that there might be less direct ways of writing that also remain a viable pathway for artistic research. That's just like a kind of remark I have to the possibility of interrupting and trying to come very close, which is a valid and very interesting pathway, but maybe not the only one. Durations of interruptions may vary from just a few seconds. Think of that little moment of reflection in a musical rehearsal when you interrupt your playing. You were just not happy with something, or you felt something, you interrupt, you take it back, and you repeat what you just played in a slightly different way, testifying in a way to the reflectivity that happened in that very small moment. But an interruption may, of course, also be a very large break, the time you take for an intense experience or insight to incubate. We could also think of iterations of smaller interruptions through which insight can grow gradually. And conversely, we could also think about interrupting habits in artistic practice. And this will most likely require an iteration of negative interruptions, because it's about persistent resisting of impulses or habits to make way for something else. And from such temporal perspective, the question of whether we call something a research project or simply trying out something might be ultimately a matter of degree. Before ending this provisional list, we should return to my opening question. What exactly can create reflectivity if you interrupt an artistic process? I talked about the transfer of knowledge from an in-time to an out-of-time position. But this image is perhaps misleading or even false. What can happen at the temporary interruption of an artistic process is maybe not so much a transfer as an interference. My speculation here is that when we interrupt a developing process, the cut we make is almost never pure or absolute. There usually is a kind of bleeding or an afterglow of the interrupted process. And it's exactly that afterglow that makes possible the snapshot I refer to. Otherwise, it would be impossible to grasp something of that experience. And I believe this time of the afterglow is very precious in artistic research, and more generally also in artistic creation, because it makes possible interference with elements that were not yet part of the stream, or maybe not in a conscious way, and as such may produce some form of reflectivity and creative change. And it's exactly that the combination of those two things, the fact that in the interruption you may start reflecting, but also reflecting on how to do it differently, that it's also about creation. A straightforward example of such interference might be the musician interrupting her playing to become aware of the environment, of the room, of the resonant qualities of the room, the atmosphere. And then afterwards, the audible impact of this experience when she keeps this awareness when continuing playing. It's just like a small example. And also it's a good example, I believe, to how an interruption may open the linearity of the music or the artistic time flow for things or processes with different time scales or life cycles or durations. Finally, although my focus has been mainly on the self-reflectivity of the researching artist, of course the artistic performance as a whole can also act as an interruption within an environment or within society. And this is the old ideal of the artwork creating a shock effect in the world. At its best, triggering awareness and reflectivity in society. And bringing this back to the process of artistic research, interruptions always can go in two directions. When we reflect or write about our practice, we need to go back to it in time to challenge any kind of assumptions we are making. If there is one thing that is crucial to artistic research, it is that it needs the shocks from practice and from the experience of something that moves, inspires, and convinces on its own terms. And I would like to stop it here. Thank you for your attention. Sure.
Yeah, I can see how the interruption conceptually fits.
Fits very well.
With your,
yes.
So we'll just reconfigure ourselves and we will move to Q&A, and hopefully you also have some questions. Yeah, so 2 to 5 minutes.
Good.
Yeah.
And if you have any questions, please point your finger, raise your finger, and bring the microphone. Or you can get up here and talk directly. Up to you. Chairs or yeah, I'll get a chair.
Maybe it's equal.
30 and 40. do we have? Okay. So, great. So we're back, and yeah, I forgot, I think, to say before the short break, thank you very much for this amazingly rich, I think, talk.
So, yeah.
Paul, I will try to kick off, but I'm painfully aware that in the room there are actually people that are more qualified than I am to to ask questions about your particular topic. But one thing I was thinking about was this whole concept of artistic research as an interruptive practice, and would seem to imply also an idea of moving between, of course, performing and reflection. And I was thinking about it, you hinted at it as a kind of a non-linear process also, that maybe could break up some of the linearities between how we learn to do things and to reflect about them. And I was wondering, when are you kind of mature enough to do that as an artist? And I was wondering if it implies also a certain high-level skill set, like the musicians' examples that you showed. They were all, of course, very accomplished in their fields. So when do you, as an artist or a musician or artistic researchers, when are you able to do this? Or is it something that also could be integrated earlier in educational systems? Do you have an idea about this? Is it a linear movement where you come to this point, or is it another, model?
Yeah, thank you. I think a very good question, and I think lots of institutions are reflecting on how to deal with this question, actually. Research has been integrated all over Europe, I think, more or less, or accepted more or less, at the master's level, but much less so at the bachelor level. To give one example of what your question is also maybe pointing at, and this is actually one of the things conservatories, academies of music are dealing with today, I believe, and then it's a question that transcends the question of artistic research. I believe it's not a question about whether should we have something that we name or label artistic research at the bachelor's level. It's rather about, indeed, where and how should we integrate aspects of reflection, which is also a very vague term, but things like that, where musicians not only play, but also are able to, what I called in my lecture, report, in a way, from what they are doing or what they are experiencing. And I don't think, as such, that this is a kind of skill that only can come after you are the mature musician or something like that. I actually see it happening with, I had a talk, a session with first-year students this week. And it struck me that actually in the youngest generation, these students are able much more, I think, than before to speak and to reflect and connect what they are doing to the world around them, to what happens. Maybe that's also the situation we're all in. Things have become urgent, and students start to reflect upon what am I doing here. So that actually is a reflective process. But of course we can make that more concrete to the artistic practice. In what sense can this be integrated in curriculum? I don't know. Maybe people in the room are also experimenting with these kind of elements in curriculum. How to have places to reflect together, for instance. I believe it is not just one way. It can happen in the individual lesson, it can happen in group lessons, it can happen in separate modules where people discuss specific topics. So there are so many ways to deal with the notion of sharing something beyond your own practice. I don't know if that is a very provisional kind of answer, but maybe somebody in the room could expand on this.
If people want to pick up on this or other questions, feel free. But you need to use the microphone for the stream.
thank you very much. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay, good. So this is really interesting. So it's just picking up of this before going on to a lot of other interesting questions that we hopefully can cover. We just talked about this with the imitation. I'm using also, we have a research project where we, as one of the pillars, has this. It's about interpretation in classical music. So one of the pillars is that we look at early 1900 interpretation, and we have also been looking into Anna Scott's work. And actually, just recently, it became aware for us. So we are really like it now. So, but I've been using this. I've tried to use this imitation work for my solo students. For instance, imitating older recordings, which is a very interesting tool for developing your artistic practices. It's really, really difficult to do. I mean, we all have this experience that, as she said, that you can notate so much, and you can be, say, for instance, I've done it with Alfred Cortot from the 30s, which is also this strange alien world of playing. And you can only go to a certain level, and then you have to transcend somehow. You have to go behind your details, and you have to go. But when I did this with my students, and back to this idea, I found out that actually, especially on the early stages, on the bachelor level and the early years, their competence in actually sensing what was going on in this recording that they were going to imitate were not developed enough. They didn't have the distinctions, they didn't hear the same things as I did. So in that way, the method was that kind of method that on a higher level is extremely good for challenging your own habits and interpretational framework, was too early somehow. But as we also just discussed, maybe, okay, you should just say, okay, now we use it as a method, and we use this for developing, and we go on and so on. But it's just to say that even if we want to do some of this, there's some kind of, we have to find out when it's not just something that is put onto them that they don't understand, or that doesn't have the effect that we want. So this was just as an example of this. I hope you know.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you want to respond?
No, it's not really a question. I think here it's an acknowledgement of yeah, for some things you need some expertise to tackle it or to, yeah.
Okay, another question. Really interesting talk. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot, I think. One thing that puzzled me a little bit was a concept that you introduced at some point called an artistic hypothesis. And you presented it as something that you can test in a performance. But I never really understood what it was. So like what makes it a hypothesis, and how is an artistic hypothesis different from a regular hypothesis, and what can we use this concept for in artistic research?
I'm even not sure if I would like to defend this concept. I only used it as hypothetically when I was making this analogy with more regular or common research time models. And so I tried to make the comparison. What if you look at the preparation of a scientific experiment, where you have to put everything in place, controlled environment and so on. What if you look at an artistic performance in the same way? From such perspective, you could regard the performance as some kind of test of an experiment that is set up through everything that comes before, namely deciding what to play, how, and so on, how to rehearse, all those things. So in that sense, all the things preceding the performance could be regarded altogether as some kind of, this is the artistic hypothesis, and the performance is the experiment. And then we evaluate it. So that's the only way I was using it. But I'm not defending this as something we should embrace or something. No.
So what could be an example of an artistic hypothesis in this kind of setup? So you prepare something that you want to test in your performance. So just to get like an example of it, like it's just to understand how would it sound. artistic hypothesis?
Well, for instance, when you would decide to prepare in a different way than you would do usually in a normal way, whether it's in a rehearsal process, whether you, for instance, that's actually a very stupid kind of example, but during the COVID crisis, maybe you could prepare online and then come together and just play. That in itself, is that even possible to rehearse online? Or you can imagine all kinds of things. Rehearsals of bigger ensembles without a conductor might be a kind of experiment to see if something else emerges when they perform. But there are so many experiments we can imagine in the preparation for a performance that could be regarded as a hypothesis.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So like your normal performance is like your control, and you come up with something that you do differently, and you see what kind of effect
Yeah,
does it have.
yeah.
Thanks.
That's how I meant it. Yeah.
Do we have more comments from the floor? Questions now?
I can ask another question, but
Well, you're welcome to.
Okay.
Otherwise, I will chip.
Okay,
Otherwise, I
thanks.
will chip in.
okay. Another thing that I was really interested in is this tension between proximity and distance that you talked about, and you know that's really true, and it's really exciting when you can kind of step in and out of being completely embodied in what you're doing and having kind of a scientific distance from what you're doing or something like that. But it's unclear to me what the kind of normative aspect in this is. So like, is it good to be more proximate to what you're doing, or is it good to be able to see everything from a distance, or is it something about the good artistic research is the one that can move the closest to the practice, and while also the furthest away? Is it like the span of movement on this trajectory, or is like one better than the other? Like what's if you were to say something about what's the good artistic research?
My answer will be very disappointing because I don't have the good answer to this question. But in a way, I was answering it to some extent in my with my last slide, in the sense that we could indeed, I see the possibility of diving a bit deeper into possibilities of dealing with our time, especially in musical artistic research. I don't think we have gone far enough with thinking about the methods we use when doing artistic-based or practice-based research, especially with regard to time. I really believe there is a potential there. Like I said, this was just like an idea, like with the recording studio, like the conversation between the sound engineer and the pianist, which is a very special relation because they both have a kind of common goal. They listen. The sound engineer listens in a very different way than a normal concert goer. So they share some intentionality. They share the time, but they are very differently positioned, and that creates an enormous potential, critical potential. And that in itself, I don't see that so often in an artistic research project. To use that potential of the social interaction and the listening together, for instance, using different positions and doing something with that in a clearly defined method. That's something we can develop, I believe. It's not the only thing we should do. Like I said, I also strongly believe that more distant ways of engaging with your experience, and also really, I'm talking about trusting your experience and writing about this in a way that is much more distant, is, in my opinion, can be as valid as well. To just give, I'm maybe a very bad example in that personally. I'm from the first generation of artistic research PhDs, at least in the Low Countries. At my time, so in between 2005 and 2010, there was still a kind of undecidedness about the format of artistic research. The the choice that we could do whatever we invented, actually, and we had to defend it, of course. And so, and there should be, it was already the necessity of having a kind of connection between what you present artistically and discursively. But I decided not to write at all about my own practice. I simply refused. And I used my experience as an artist to write what I had to write, which was about artistic practice in general, or the practice of other artists. And I'm really convinced that nobody else could do that. That was from my position as a creative artist that I was writing this, but without talking about my own practice at all. So that's just an extreme example of why I'm a bit reluctant at defending this too much, because nowadays I would not be accepted in such a program anymore. It's simply not accepted anymore to do an artistic research without having your own practice very central in anything discursively. So, but that still, I believe we can have many pathways, and it depends also personalities and mindsets, and you have for some people it works very well to write and to speak, but for others another pathway can be as legitimate, I would say. So yeah, I don't have one answer to your question in that sense, but I do believe we can develop better methods or new kinds of or fresh kind of perspectives on methodology in artistic research, especially in relation to time. That's something I'm convinced about. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was really interesting. Maybe it's more a comment. I don't know really, but I had this idea that you're talking about the interruption as a tool for or a method, and I couldn't help thinking about the glitch somehow. That it has some similarities to it, right? That something goes wrong, and then here now suddenly you can see something. But I also started thinking about that. Well, what it opens up to, at least in electronic music, right? It opens up into computer programming and stuff like that, which has got nothing to do with the music as such. And I was wondering if these glitches, if we transfer them into this disruption, also is opening a door into something very different. Actually. That it's not really, it's not the thing anymore. It's something else. I don't know. It's just a wonder in relation to the concept. And another was the break in the process. I mean, when you rehearse something, you have to go through these breaks anyway. So it's already a part of working. It's not really something that's a break anymore because it's integrated in a way. And I guess when you step in and you become this kind of tool person, you are a scientist and a musician, and it's also something you perform, say. And I was wondering, would a method be then, or could it be possible that to reproduce the interruption, actually, like looking at it from a more meta-like position, saying even that is something that we more or less deliberately do. We know it happens. We know that in a moment something will go wrong, and then we will look at it. Can we re-perform it, and so on? And of course, I think this has to do with the mediation also. When Anna is listening to the music as she's playing it, there's also kind of multiple situations inside it somehow. And I was just wondering, maybe you could also take the method that she was doing while recreating as a method for investigation. I don't know. I was just wondering. I know.
thank you so much. Fantastic comments, but it's quite a lot. So I would like first to come back to your first comment about the glitch, the kind of interruption. I like that very, very much. What you open up here is also the creating a context where you accept that interruptions can happen. That in itself is already seems crucial for a research context, because when, of course, glitch became a genre, and there the interruption is no interruption anymore. In a way, it just becomes another tool to make music. But in a sense, indeed, the interruption as becoming aware of, oh, there is a potential here. That moment is very interesting in the example of glitch, and it's something we also find in other examples of late 20th century music, for instance. Or my research was very much focused on very physical things in music, and for instance, the music of Helmut Lachenmann and what he called musique concrète instrumentale, so which is a music that, in its definition, expresses its own coming into being. So it's becoming aware that when you produce a tone, you never only hear a pure tone, you also hear something of the effort of the musician, you hear something of the beginning of the resistance of the instrument. These all are like impure things interrupting in the purity of what we of a 19th century kind of idea of classical music. And becoming aware of these impurities suddenly makes aware of a whole new dimension in music, and indeed has become really influential. And also every composer today uses extended techniques to have also these other kind of senses of sound, and so indeed it opens up. So, and that's the real potential of the interruption. It opens up. It is not yet. That's what I said or tried to point at. It's not yet a method. An interruption is not. It can be a tool. It could be, perhaps, also pointing to some of the things you said afterwards. We could indeed create an environment where we accept interruptions or alert for interruptions to happen. But I think the most forceful are the kind of interruptions that we can't predict too much, of course, even in such an environment. Then they become interesting, because otherwise also we would not be alert. So so you have the same tension field again there. So I think it's all about creating the situation or the environment to be alert. There was also a word that Kevin Fairbairn brought up, a kind of cultivating of alertness for things that happen and that may interrupt your playing or your thinking, or that is the crux, I think, is the essence of the whole notion of interruption, as I see it. I'm not sure if I touched on some things, but not everything.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, so I have a question, and it relates to something that for me is the question when we are doing this, is that when is something artistic research and when is it high-level artistic practice? And it relates to your final ideas of this interrupting habits, where we were talking about the practicing. And as a performer of classical music, of course, I view the practicing as our main creative process. This is where we work with our material, which is the musical work. And this is where we engage in this process of working with it. And I've had another project, and I'm using in my teaching also the videotaping of actual practicing, in order to actually, what you say with the composer, to try to look what is happening and to create the distance by actually looking at yourself or looking at my students practicing and so on. And of course, when practicing, a main component of quality is when you stop and what you do after you've stopped. Right, because repetition is the main element of practicing a classical music piece. So I'm working a lot with myself and the student of kind of enhancing the quality of knowing, first of all, when to stop, when to repeat something, or when to go on, and what what the strategy changes involved are. So my question is, the method of interruption and using this for becoming aware and developing is already quite established in practicing as such, and one must presume that high-level artistic performers are masters of this reflective process somehow, because this is how they got to where they are, by constantly, using this process to improving. So presumably that is not artistic research what they do. How does it become artistic research, or is this a question that is meaningful for me to ask?
Well, you can answer this question if it is meaningful to you. That question, and that depends, of course. Might also depend a bit of the context. I've never been very enthusiastic about kind of essentialistic kind of discussions about whether something should be called artistic research or not, whether we can. But of course, context matters. So if you're working in an academic context or where this word is being used, then you have to deal with the expectations. And indeed, artistic research involves certain elements, like indeed it probably should be an artist doing it, first of all. So that's crucial. So the artistic practice should be key. Otherwise, why call it artistic research? I'm not even starting discussion about what the outcomes should be, because that's a discussion. Should be, to what extent should there be a discursive part, how much, and so on and so on. But what I prefer to, from the perspective of my lecture today, from a meta perspective, I prefer to look at it as something that you use when you want to change something, and that might be the difference. When in this artistic practice, where indeed you use, of course, dealing with time is really important, but you do it in a specific way. You have a repertoire of methods, and when you try to challenge that in your artistic practice, then it might become some kind of research. Maybe. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, definitely. I mean,
so it's about changing, opening for possible change. That is a kind of necessity, I would say, and that's where I see the connection with that notion of interruption. It's interrupting something very literally, the flow of the music, but maybe also the way you do your music, or you make things.
So the concept of some kind of exploration is maybe here.
Oh, sorry?
Exploration is to use it as a tool for exploring, or to kind of go out of your habits or your intuition or your normal artistic identity is important. Do you think? I mean, I would agree. Yeah, I mean, I think.
Yeah, it's only a starting point, of course. As I said, the interruption itself is just a cut, but it's what happens afterwards what will matter. Yeah.
So we might also have questions from the online realm. So Christina, would you be so kind to maybe read up one of these?
Yes, there's one here from Katiani Dash, and she said, "Thank you for your talk." And she asked, what is the difference between your notion on reporting in the interruptive practice and journaling after a performance experience? Could you please elaborate on this? And she continues, I would love to know more about the specifics of the practice of reporting that you mentioned in your talk.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the question as well. Yeah, I refer to journaling when I try to conceptualize this notion of interruption and say, like, well, how can we use this word? We can use an interruption indeed to come very close to the time of performance. And what you could do in such an interruption, because it's such a precious moment, there is still something of the freshness of the experience, there is what I call the afterglow. The obvious way to report from this is indeed use that moment to immediately note something down, like almost spontaneously, and then collect these things in a systematic way. And that indeed is being used by quite a lot of artists, I think, like reporting in a kind of journaling method right after their rehearsals or in their creation processes for themselves, very often to reflect upon what they are doing, to understand at a later stage what happening there, even maybe not understanding when you write it down, but at a later stage taking back these notes and then seeing a pattern of, oh wait, what was happening there is actually very special. So that's what I meant with the journaling method, resembling a bit some kind of I think that comes from anthropology and autoethnographic kind of research methods. But that what I said that afterwards is that should not be the only way to report from our artistic practice. I also believe that we can talk and write about our experiences and use these experiences to share knowledge in a much less direct way, and that's what I was arguing for. And so that I refer to Susan Tunka, who's dealing with I cannot say it in her place, so but with almost esoteric practices and knowledge, and the interdisciplinarity between academia and these practices in dance. And she shared with us that she was being advised by her supervisors to indeed find these ways to come very close to the dancing. So finding ways of writing that in a way copy what happens in the dancing. And she felt like, but actually it doesn't seem to work very well for me. And the more I try to really grasp what is happening in the performance, the more abstract my language gets. And it's maybe something others will recognize as well. I recognize this very much. So I needed to conceptualize, and that's all very concrete while it's very, very abstract language. So, and that's also a way of reporting, I would say. So, but these are just like two extremes. But in between we have so many possibilities of reporting from our practice. So, yeah. Listen to how musicians talk, and you have already a bunch of possibilities of how to report from practice. Is that a good enough question?
It's probably a very good answer.
I think so, yes.
Answer, sorry.
If I may just steal a little bit of time, because I thought I want to return to the nature of the interruptions that we're discussing. And because you remember in the beginning of my introduction, you were surprised I quoted this time of research, because I found another really interesting quote in that, which I think relates to your talk also. You said in that piece that artistic research is research motivated from within artistic practice. And I think what we've been discussing here today is also very much concerning this within. I mean, when you talk about the creative changes that could occur through these interruptions, I still kind of see them as changes in the practice itself, but that would perhaps always be the case, but it seems to be, more of a level of, it's relating very much to the intention of the project from the very beginning, even though it might introduce some kind of cut in the technique and so on. But I'm wondering about, other kinds of interruptions that brings the practice maybe in dialogue with an unforeseen social dimension. Actually, you had that word as well in the beginning of your talk. And the previous speaker in this series is Akiko Pelto. He talked about artistic research as an opportunity also to engage with non-artistic phenomena, but in an artistic way. And do you have thoughts about how this interruptive practice also could, open up to the social or cultural or political dimensions?
Yeah, well, it's just a word, of course, but as it happens with words, they take us elsewhere. So indeed, I think I also mentioned it at the end of the talk, that I that everything was very much related now to what happens inside the practice, the self-reflectivity in that sense, and not so much the self-evident use of the word in artistic practice to use performance as interrupting something in the world. So you perform to interrupt. You, as a performer, you interrupt anyway something, or of course the obvious examples are things that you could do in public space, where you can have interventions is the word we use then. So in that sense, of course, we see quite a lot of artistic research dealing with that. And that's interesting to indeed further elaborate on that notion of interruption indeed, because I believe that it requires the researcher or the musician to be very aware and to of what happens when you make such an interruption around you, what such interruption indeed causes, or so. But I have to say I don't have a very concrete example now. I don't know if you had something in mind that could connect to it.
But I was thinking more actually still in the practice.
Oh, okay.
But you know, not necessarily that you go out and interrupt stuff with your practice, but which, as you say, in a way always do. But you know, in some way I could see an interruption where you're doing something that somebody finds inappropriate, or you're doing something where you afterwards reflect on it and realize that the way that you represented a certain aspect in your work was maybe, you should have done it in another way, or it didn't relate to something else than the artistic practice that still influences you to take it maybe in a new direction in response to a social or cultural reality. Something, I think we're living in times where this is happening all the time. Where it's not. You, as an artist, you're not, entitled in a way to do anything. So I'm thinking maybe we're living in interrupted times where things get interrupted.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I would like to make the difference there between the interruption and then you came up with that word, the break, and I think it's a good distinction between those two words. And then of course it depends what or who is making the interruption. So we should distinguish between all those things to have a meaningful discussion about this. But indeed, I believe you have the interruption as a kind of event that maybe goes by something coming from the outside or from inside the practice. But what happens in the break, that's really where there might be both a responsibility and a potential for artistic research. Like I gave that example of the musician stopping playing just to become aware of the environment, and then taking the time to get that kind of imprint of the environment, and then going back to your performance and feeling how it changes your performance. That's in a way getting the outside in a quite direct way, I would say. And of course you can transpose this to any kind of situation or issue even. So where you take note of, or where you observe and you cultivate a kind of alertness in that break after the interruption. Yeah, I don't know if that is more or less kind of answer.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
We're probably running out of time, but there might be more. Christina?
No, I just feel like coming, because you're talking so much about the interruption, and I don't know much about music, that's the truth, but I know a lot about the interruption in other genres, and maybe it could be interesting for you to hear, like, because in the 30s, for example, the German dramatiker Bertolt Brecht worked with this Abbruchfigur, interruption figure in theater, and he made it into a theoretical term also, that he put shocks in his plays to wake up people from whatever they were in the 30s in Germany. And at the same time, actually, Walter Benjamin talks about the potential in the interruption from architecture, from film, from the shift between rooms, from the facade, like when you walk from one kind of architecture to another, when you wake up, the moment between sleeping and being awake, you also have these interruptions or breaks or cuts in reality. And these forms, like they actually also root from the Romantics, the idea of the fragment as an aesthetic form where the fragment works or uses the breaks or the interruptions between different genres or different forms to invoke the viewer or the listener. And just to round off with the music, also at the same time, I know one of my few music, I don't know, whatever. But at the same time, actually, Debussy, I know in one of the classical plays, he interrupts, he thinks, I don't know why, but probably he wanted to wake up the audience, and he hits on his notes, whatever, what is it called? Statue? No stand. And if in some theories it is called, or it's called the first example of musique concrète. But at that time, people just left the room in a, you know. So, but it's some, I mean, in other genres, interruption also works as a way to wake people.
Sure.
And form the artistic practice.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, also the Brecht example is something I need to dive into. Yeah.
How are we feeling with time? I think we should. Yeah, it's 5. Oh, we've actually been discussing a long time,
See?
which is a good sign. If there's any kind of concluding, yeah.
It's a bit more general question. Just having you here with your expertise. As a performing classical musician, I'm part of an environment that's kind of not so used in engaging in these kind of more abstract or what is viewed as maybe not so concrete ways of thinking that artistic research is. So for me, it's quite crucial when doing this project to at least think in, and it's maybe some kind of maybe the opposite, what was just being said, that how can we, so my question is, what is your experience with getting the knowledge that we find in these projects back into the, what do you say, mainstream classical music community? Because for me, this is kind of the main, this must be one of the main reasons why we're doing what we do, is to develop the environment, the practice as a genre or as a field. And the practitioners of classical music are, of course, you know, all our colleagues that are not doing this. So we were talking about going from artistic research, artistic practice to research in the beginning. So the question is, how do we go, what are the possibilities, what do you experience with going from artistic research back into the practice, back into the community?
That's a huge question, especially as you explain the situation here. I don't know the situation very well, so but yes, it's long-term work, I would say, to start with. Maybe it's not necessary to always frame your results as research. So maybe it's also a matter of what actually are the results of your. Sometimes a research project leads to very different kinds of outcomes. Artistic products, maybe things you can publish somewhere. So maybe it's many things that you have as outcomes. And maybe you don't have to give it all, like, this is something you have to understand. We have done all this, and this all connects. Maybe you should pragmatically also look at what can work at the first stage. what would people interested in hearing, in learning about. I would certainly advise as much as possible to involve people in research. That has been, at least at the conservatoire I am working, has been the key to get some kind of culture, research culture, is to involve as much people as possible with research. From teachers, starting with teachers even, to students. And if this is not yet the case, then of course you have to be aware that this is a slow process, probably. But explaining is often not the best way in my experience. So explaining why artistic research is important is maybe not the first thing you have to do. Maybe it's for rather looking at opportunities. Maybe we have something interesting. We are doing an experiment. Maybe you can communicate about this and invite people in, and they get excited and they want to learn more about it. So things like that, I guess. And all the rest is institutional work that takes time, I would say.
Yeah, maybe this actually connects to, you mentioned at some point new materialism, which would have been an interesting tangent to explore, but one lesson from that is also that things work in the world also by themselves in a way. So maybe we should focus more on this question of, what artistic research does than these eternal discussions of what is it really and so on. And then
yes.
As we close here today, we should continue doing this and learning and spreading it. Yeah.
Exactly. Call for doing, yes.
So thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you all for having me.
Thank you to Jyske Musikkonservatorium.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just so you know, we're returning with further events, of course, in the autumn, but not here. We're not returning here. But you can follow us online or in Copenhagen. We have our Artistic Research Forum, which is the next one on the 28th of September, where we always present 2 COV projects. And then we have our symposium on the 27th and 28th of October at Kunsthalle Charlottenborg and Rhythmic Musikkonservatorium in Copenhagen. And that has the title Transformative Futures, Reimaginations of Time, Space and Materiality in Artistic Research. So you're very welcome to that.
Remember that.